Brandon and Mandy and Sucressa for leading us in that song. Take out your Bibles and turn to Ephesians. I said 1 Corinthians. Ephesians. Glad to be back with you. Had a great time up in Indiana. Just a music week for almost 8 days. So a lot of you have asked me if I played, and the answer is no. I refuse to play in front of professional concert artists. I had a lot of time seeing old friends. And I got to go to a great church with my cousin last week, had an awesome worship service there, and I got to spend a few days at Indiana University. My teacher there that I said was my senior year is retiring, or just retired, and they had a tribute concert to the professor that I stayed with for 3 years, and he has since passed away. So it was a great time to see a bunch of old college buddies, and there were only 3 of us in the bachelor program at that particular time, and all 3 of us were there, so that was kind of neat. And so they told me that I hadn't changed at all. I really couldn't say that for every one of them. But anyways, we had a really good time. Georges Clemenceau was a former French prime minister, and he used to engage his rivals in a duel. And of course, you all remember what duels are. That's when 2 people had guns and they took 10 paces away and turned around, and whoever got killed lost. And so he used to have these duels, and that's how he dealt with his rivals. And one time, he was going to a Paris train station to buy a ticket to go where he was going to engage his rival in a duel. And he bought a one-way ticket. And the ticket master there said, Prime Minister, he says, "Isn't this a little pessimistic that you're only getting a one-way ticket down there?" To that which the Prime Minister replied, "No, you need to understand. I always use my opponent's ticket for the way back." I wish I was that confident. I wish I was that confident. Like I told you this week when I was up there, there was an instrument set up there at the convention center, and somebody said, "Are you going to play?" No, I just really don't feel comfortable playing. I don't feel that confident right now in my playing. It's been a long time. I remember several years ago when I started on my doctorate degree, when I first looked at it, I said, 30 hours, no big deal. That's not that much time, and I did the seminars, and that seemed to be okay. And we got down to a week-long session in Atlanta before we were starting to write up the project, the big last half of the degree. And I remember every idea that I had seemed to get shot down, and everything that I thought I was going into it I was going to do just didn't seem to work. And I remember by the end of the week sitting on the steps of the building practically in tears thinking, there is no way I can do this. I just can't pull this off. And it was a really tough time for me during that time. And I would imagine if most of us would look at ourselves and think about it, we probably struggle with our confidence. We really struggle with our confidence as disciple makers. We really struggle with that when somebody comes to our door, maybe a Jehovah's Witness, and they're going to try and convert us to their misunderstanding of the gospel, and we're talking to them, but many times we're afraid to talk to them or engage them because we're afraid before the conversation's over, we're going to turn into a Buddhist. And so a lot of times we're just scared to death to engage people in spiritual talk. We're just not confident. You may feel insecure even about your salvation. So as a result of that, you just have a hard time witnessing to people. And a lack of confidence keeps so many Christians on the sidelines. They use excuses like, "I just don't know enough," or "I'm just not really sure how to lead somebody to the Lord," or "I just don't know if I can be used by God." And yet, if we are going to be the church that God has called us to be, then we have to learn how to minister confidently. If we're going to be the disciple that God has called us to be, the disciples, we need to learn to minister confidently. I mean, just think about it. If you're in the locker room and you're on a football team, you don't want the coach coming into the locker room saying, "I really don't know if we can win. You guys really aren't that good." Do you think they're going to go out and win the game? No. You don't want a general on the night before the invasion talking to the troops and saying, "Guys, we're outnumbered, we're outmanned, they have more weapons than us, but hey, what's the worst that can happen? Let's go out and give it a best shot." No. You want the general, even if you're outnumbered and outmanned, say, "We can do it, we can beat them, we can do this." And the same is for the church and for us as individuals. We are not going to be the disciple makers that God has called us if we have a lack of confidence and if we're walking around saying, "I just don't know, I'm just not so sure if God can use me at all." Now, we're going to go through for the next several weeks in the book of Ephesians, and I'm really excited about this series. It's been called the Queen of the Epistles. John Mackay, the former president of Princeton Theological Seminary, said, to this book, to the book of Ephesians, I owe my life. And I'll tell you, as I've been studying this now for the last several weeks, I really, really am excited about this book and about this series, because this is a great book about discipleship. It's a great book about a disciple-making church and what it takes to be a disciple maker. Now, Paul wrote this letter from a Roman prison cell. He hadn't been in Ephesus for about 5 years. Now, he knew the church of Ephesus really well. In fact, Paul was the founder of the church of Ephesus. You see, on one of his trips there, he went through Ephesus and he stopped at the Jewish synagogue and he began to preach. And he spent the first year preaching in the synagogue, and a lot of Jews had become Christians. But the Jewish leaders weren't happy that a lot of their converts, their people from the Jewish synagogue, were being converted into Christianity. So they ran Paul out of the synagogue. Well, then he took the gospel to the marketplace. I love it. He went to the Hall of Tyrannus, which is a place where the philosophers would do their thing all during the day. And Paul used the blank spot there to minister the gospel. And for 2 years in the Hall of Tyrannus, he talked about the gospel in the marketplace. And as a result, a lot of Gentiles had come into the church. And Paul loved this church, and they loved him. In fact, there's a story account in the book of Acts when Paul's going to Jerusalem, and he felt like he was probably going to die there. And he wasn't going exactly in Ephesus, but he's going nearby, and he called for the elders of the church there in Ephesus. And the elders came down, and they met with Paul, and they cried, and they wept together as Paul told them what was lying ahead. He loved these people, and they really, really loved him. I mean, it's a little bit different than the church at Corinth. Now, I want you to understand that life was not easy for Christians in Ephesus. Not by any means. In the city of Ephesus was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Temple of Artemis. And because of Paul's preaching and all the Gentiles now coming to Christ, there was a real problem with the people that ran the Temple of Artemis, because now they were losing a big segment of their paying population, and people were no longer buying the silver and the gold and all the things that were needed for the worship of their goddess there in the Temple of Artemis. And as a result, there was this huge riot that happened in the city. Now, they didn't get Paul, but they got 2 of his associates, Gaius and Aristarchus, and they drugged them into the theater, which seated around 25,000, they tell us. And for 2 hours, the people chanted, "Great is the God of Artemis." For 2 hours, they chanted and chanted and chanted. And finally, the city clerk came out and quieted them down and said, "There's nothing getting resolved here. Please leave." And fortunately, nobody was killed. But right after that, Paul had to leave Ephesus because it was getting extremely dangerous for him to stay there. But he knew these people, and he loved these people, and he also knew how difficult it was for them here in Ephesus. And yet, this church at this point is thriving. It is a disciple-making church. Bill Hall, in his book, The Disciple-Making Church, cites Ephesus as being the example of a disciple-making church. And I felt, as we're getting ready to move into the fall and looking at our discipleship strategy and things like that, I felt like this would be a great series to talk about a disciple maker. What is a disciple maker? And so you see up here, my guy, okay? Some of y'all have been making all sorts of comments about him. I thought about standing behind this thing and just preaching, but I decided I wouldn't do that. All right. This is our portrait of a disciple. And over the next several weeks, we're going to build this portrait. And what I want to challenge you and I to do is, as we look at what God says a disciple looks like, to ask ourselves, does that describe me? The first 3 chapters of Ephesians, we're going to talk about who or what is a disciple. Okay, what is a disciple? And then the last half of Ephesians, we're going to look at what does a disciple do? How does a disciple minister in his relationships at home? How does he minister in his relationships at work? How does he minister in his relationships in general? And so we're going to look at the last half of the series of how does a disciple live? How does he or she live his or her life? The first part, the next 6 weeks, is what is a disciple? So we're going to look at the book of Ephesians here this morning. And I just want to challenge you this morning to be confident in your disciple making.